Hello, I'm the 10-minute English teacher. Let's get you exam ready. Today we're thinking about An Inspector Calls by Priestley, and I'm going to be providing you with a summary to the entire play. Before we get going, don't forget to like and subscribe. There are plenty of things on the channel to help you get ready for both English language and English literature. Okay, An Inspector Calls, the entire play. Act 1 is in front of you. There are 8 key images. Each one of those relates to a significant moment. I'll walk you through it now. So it begins with the curtain rising and we see Edna the parlourmaid replacing champagne glasses with a cigar box and port. The family around the table, they're celebrating the engagement of Sheila, Mr. and Mrs. Burling's daughter, to Gerald Croft, the son of wealthy business owners. Mr. Burling begins to make a toast to the couple, but that toast ends up being all about him rather than them. He starts talking about money and business and what it would mean if the Crofts and Burlings went into business together. It would mean lower costs and higher prices. He then goes on to talk about society and talks about the idea of community being nonsense and talks about the Titanic, saying that it's unsinkable, absolutely unsinkable. And it's at that point that the inspector arrives. Inspector Gould turns up to speak to the Burling family about a girl who's died, and Mr. Burling tries to ingratiate himself with the inspector by talking about the fact that he was Lord Mayor once and knows Colonel Roberts, the chief inspector at the police station. Mr. Burling is then spoken to by the inspector, and we find out that Eva Smith worked at his factory and he had to sack her because she asked for higher wages and was part of organising a strike. He's very defensive of his actions and doesn't see that he's got any responsibility. Sheila is then spoken to by the inspector and we find out her part in the downfall of the girl. She was at a department store called Millward's where Eva Smith was working, and in a fit of jealous rage she asked her to be sacked, otherwise she would close her accounts. The inspector then tells us that the girl changed her name to Daisy Renton, and Gerald gives the game away and shows that he has known her in some way, shape or form. The inspector leaves to speak to Mr. and Mrs. Burling, and Sheila wants Gerald to be truthful, but Gerald is keen to keep the truth from the inspector. Act 1 ends with the inspector entering the room again, ready to speak to Gerald. And then we move on to Act 2, which is in front of you now. I'll walk you through Act 2. Act 2 begins with Gerald speaking to the inspector. We find out his role in the downfall of the girl. He met her at the Palace Bar and then took her and kept her as his mistress, offering her giving her money and letting her live in some rooms that were owned by a friend in town. Eventually, he called that relationship off, but it was a time that Daisy Renton was very happy, although at the same time, he has betrayed Sheila in doing so. Sheila then says that she respects Gerald more than she ever has done before, but she gives him the engagement ring back, and at that point he disappears to go out and get some fresh air. Just to keep us on track, the inspector then says, "Where is Eric?" He wants to speak to Eric at some point. But before that, he needs to speak to Mrs. Burling. He speaks to Mrs. Burling about her involvement in the girl's downfall. She introduced herself at the charity committee where Mrs. Burling works as Mrs. Burling, which Mrs. Burling, of course, thought was very rude, and she refused her any charity or assistance. The girl said that she didn't want to accept stolen money from somebody who she was seeing. And it's at that point the inspector talks about the money, but then releases the information that the girl who died was pregnant at the time. Mrs. Burling then quite predictably blames the father and says that he should be made a public show and that he should take responsibility and they can't be held accountable. Sheila, who is a little bit more insightful than the other characters at this point, she realises exactly what the inspector's doing as he starts echoing Mrs. Burling's words to her, and she demands her mother to stop, and we can see that we know exactly where this is going, and at that point Eric arrives. He returns home and we know that Eric is going to be the father and the next person to be spoken to by the inspector. And that leads us on to Act 3. The 8 key images for Act 3, the final act of the play, are in front of you, and I'll walk you through them now. So Act 3 begins with Eric being spoken to by the inspector. We find out that he met Eva Smith at the Palace Bar in a very drunken state, forced his way into her home and forced himself upon her, and then began a relationship with her that lasted for a few weeks, with Eric supporting her with money that he stole from his father. So Eric speaks about the money that he stole, and his father is very, very angry about the fact that Eric has taken the money from his company and doesn't really think about the idea that the girl has been a victim of Eric's abuse. The family then begin to argue, and it's at that point the inspector stops, and in a moment of authorial intrusion, Priestley speaking through the inspector makes an impassioned speech about society, talking about the idea of there being millions and millions and millions of John Smiths and Eva Smiths in society with their lives intertwined with ours. And then the inspector leaves. When the inspector leaves, the family are in turmoil. There's a lot of arguing between them, and we can see a bit of a division. The younger characters are a little bit more reflective and feel responsible, and Mr. and Mrs. Burling are completely incredulous and defiant. They don't feel like they've got any responsibility for the girl's death at all. So we can see a clear opposition between the characters at that point. Interestingly, Sheila then gives her parents a way of absolving themselves from of responsibility by talking about the idea that the inspector may not have been an inspector. And then Gerald returns to confirm that that is indeed the case. He's been out and spoken to somebody who... he's been out and spoken to a police constable in the street and has asked about Inspector Gould, and nobody has ever heard of him. Sheila doesn't want to take the ring back from Gerald. That's Mr. Burling's suggestion, that they return to normal and that the engagement's back on. She says it's too soon. So their relationship isn't completely over, but the engagement isn't back on. Mr. Burling is quite keen for everything to resume, and it just about does. He's pouring drinks, and everybody is almost back in the same sort of place and position that they were at the beginning of the play. And it's at that point that the phone rings, and a police inspector is on his way to speak to the family about a girl who has died. Okay, to take this further, I suggest you watch the video again with the sound off. Can you talk your way through the entire play in time with the yellow marker as it moves across the significant moments? And if you get stuck on one, unmute to hear the explanation by using the play bar to rewind, and then carry on thereafter. Okay, check out the other videos on my channel. I'll continue making content. Feel free to ask something you'd like me to cover in the comments section. Don't forget to like and subscribe and share, and keep revising.